This is John Musgrave. Thank you for coming to the podcast. If you like this content or this episode, please click like or even subscribe or hit that thumbs up button on your screen, and that'll help more people find us. Thanks for listening. Now Thomas, called Didymus, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands, and put my finger where the nails were, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it." A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them. Though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." Then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here and see my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." Then Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." Jesus did many other miraculous signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. Fluoride. I'm a dentist's son, so I just say that every once in a while. The Battle of Gettysburg, Genghis Khan, pre-emergent herbicide. These are all things that exist that you can't see working, or things that you'll never see. Yet we believe them all, don't we? I put fluoride on my teeth because my dad told me to, and so far it's working, but I can't see it working. I'm not quite sure where Genghis Khan lived. I think it was Mongolia, which is north of China, but I'm not sure. I'll never see him except in Night on the Museum or Mulan, perhaps. How about oxygen? I don't see oxygen, but I trust that it's there. I trust that I have to have a certain level in my blood. I trust that part of why I run is to improve my oxygen levels as I do run. A lot of things that we can't see or know for sure. As Harry Carey says, we know the moon is not made out of cheese, but if it were made of ribs, would we eat it then? But we don't. Well, we kind of know. We kind of know about the moon now because folks have been there. Or so the Germans would have us believe, huh? But this text presents us with this, and Jesus presents us with this as he interacts with Thomas, who didn't believe because he hadn't seen. And so we say, what is God communicating to us through this passage here? And number one there, if you'd like to fill out blanks in your outline. So that's a separate sheet for you there. If you'd like to fill out blanks in an outline, you're welcome to do that. God says to you this morning, believe though you haven't seen. Believe though you haven't seen. And we see that there in verse 27. He says, Thomas, believe. And you have believed because you've seen, but blessed are those who believe who haven't seen. And note there, 1a, you believe a ton of stuff. You believe a ton of stuff. The most diligent and vehement of atheists believe a ton of stuff that they can't see. Fluoride, oxygen. Now, they can do tests. But you can't live your life, and nobody lives his life without depending on things they've never tested, without trusting in things they cannot see or never will see. I've never seen the Constitution, but I trust that it's there. I've never done certain things like jump off a cliff onto rocks. I've been to Niagara Falls. Rocks below there if you go off the falls. but I trust that that wouldn't go well for me. But I've never tested that. But we believe a ton of stuff. You believe a ton of stuff you haven't or never will see. And I want you to note, God wants you to note, that's a necessary part of life. If you don't live by stuff you can't see, you won't make it through a day. You need oxygen and you breathe. You don't eat pork rinds. Well, maybe you do eat pork rinds. You don't eat pork rinds because you know what that'll do to the inside of your blood vessels, though you can't see that, right? But we live at all kinds of, you take medicine. You can't see that stuff working. You can't see that, it's not sugar inside that capsule and that it's something else. But you take it, though you don't see, though you haven't tested it. Why? Because you trust those who are giving it to you, prescribing it to you, perhaps. But you and I believe in a ton of stuff that we've never seen or that we never will see or that's impossible to see. I will never see the Battle of Gettysburg. I can Gettysburg, as they say there. Or as even if you visit the field, which I did a long time ago. You can imagine the battle there, but I will never see it. And that's a necessary part of life. And so Jesus says here to believe, and he encourages believing something that you can't see. Well, believe what? That's your next blank there. B, believe what? What is Christianity? What does Jesus want you to believe? What is Christianity's central plea? It's this. Believe this, B1, that Jesus is the eternal Son of God, the eternal Son of God, alive in heaven, risen from the dead. This is what Thomas didn't believe. He didn't believe that Jesus was risen from the dead. So there's that part. But John follows this up in verses 30 and 31. And he communicates what Jesus has been communicating all along. I've come from the Father. Now I'm here. And I'm returning to the Father. It's all through the Gospel of John. 66 times by my count. Where he says, I've come from God. I'm returning to God. I've been sent from the Father. I'm going back to the Father. 66 times in 21 chapters. That's a lot. About 3 per chapter by my math. Right, Joyce? That Jesus is the eternal Son of God. He didn't just start at his birth, but he was in heaven before. And in fact, John says at the beginning of this gospel that it was Jesus who created everything that's been created. And in the beginning of creation, when physical matter was first started, brought into existence, it was Jesus who was there with the Father, bringing it into existence, bringing physical matter out of nothing. That's a philosophical and scientific question that's met by the logic of the uncreated creator. Second thing to believe, besides Jesus being the eternal Son of God, alive in heaven, risen from the dead, which John fills in verse 31 there. But second thing Christianity and Jesus tells you to believe is this, that Jesus is the King or the Christ. Okay, we've talked about that a lot. The word the Christ means the anointed one. And if you were in the anointed one, you were the king. Okay, so just a little distinction there, right? Jesus the Christ is the Son of God, but the Christ doesn't mean Son of God. It doesn't even mean divine. Non-divine people are called the Christ in the Old Testament. It just means anointed one. Now, the anointed one, Jesus, is eternal Son of God and divine. It's just that the name Christ doesn't get at that. Okay? So John recounts both in verse 31 there. He is the Christ, which means the King, and he's also the eternal Son of God. The uncreated God who came to earth and lives on. But number 2, so that Jesus is the King, the Christ. And as the King, and this is why Christ is important. David was called the Christ, and all the prophets and priests were called Christ in Greek, as they spoke Greek in the Old Testament, or Messiah. They were called Messiahs in the Old Testament, which was the Hebrew for that, not meaning that any of them were divine. Okay? But with Jesus, that's the case. He's divine as well. But that the king, his role in Israel was to protect and provide for God's people. Those are your blanks. That's what the king did. That's his role. If you didn't have a king, Book of Judges, you weren't protected. You weren't provided for. You were oppressed. That's what the Book of Judges is about. And so the Book of Judges says, and in those days Israel had no king. And people did what was right in their own eyes. And this is always repeated after it shows God's people being oppressed and great wickedness going on in Israel. Why? Because they had no king. And so God's blessing had not come to them. And so as we talked about Palm Sunday, last Sunday, you have all these benefits of David and David's sons. And Jesus is a son of David. That's very significant. Because God blesses his people when they're under his chosen king, his anointed king, his Messiah, his Christed king. He blesses them if they're under his king. If they reject his king, he rejects them. That's the gospel, isn't it? So Jesus is the king, the Christ, who will protect and provide for you now and eternally. And so verse 31 there, that you can see in your Bibles or down toward the end there, you've got verse 31 still in the text there. These are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, that he's the King, but he's also God, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So if you have Jesus, if you believe Jesus is God, if you believe that he's your king, you've taken him to be your king, you've bowed the knee to him and said, I want to be in your kingdom, Jesus. I want you to be the one over me because I believe you will provide for me and protect me in this life and when I die and in the life to come. And so that's Christianity's plea. To believe that Jesus is alive. He's risen from the dead, but he's always lived. He's the eternal Son of God, and he's the Christ, the King. There's dispute, in verse 31 of how you arrange that sentence there. To a Jew, probably the proper arrangement is that the Christ is Jesus. Because the Jews were looking for the Christ. And John has just written a book to prove to them that the Christ that they were looking for is Jesus. And you can arrange the sentence both ways. The grammar goes in both directions there. But that's what Christianity pleads with us to do, or to anybody. So this passage exhorts you in several ways to be believing in Jesus. And it pleads with you to trust the testimony of true Christians, especially those who've suffered. Trust the testimony of true Christians, especially those who've suffered. You see this hint of suffering there in verse 19. Where are the disciples? Well, it looks like somebody owned a house in Jerusalem, or that they had a home base. You saw Peter and John when they go to the tomb the first time Peter goes with John, and they come back. It says they went back to their house. And then you see that here referenced again. And they're in their house in Jerusalem, but the door's locked because they're not safe. They're suffering. They scattered. Their leader was taken away, arrested, taken away, and crucified. And so they've suffered, and they'll suffer more for their faith in Jesus. So what's their testimony? Verse 25. Thomas comes back, and you see they say, "We've seen the Lord." Thomas was out he snuck out in disguise, got some tacos at Taco Bell. And he came back, so they all didn't have to go out and get caught and imprisoned. All right, so he sneaks out and gets some food, maybe. That's why he was out. And Jesus shows up then, under God's sovereignty, so he could teach us this lesson. But Thomas comes back, and they testify, we've seen the Lord. Now, you saw already that this had happened when we read Luke 24. You have that conglomeration of things that the disciples, the 11 and others are in the house, and they're talking about, he's appeared to Peter, they say there. Now Paul recounts that in 2 Corinthians 15:5. We don't have a narrative of Jesus appearing just to Peter. But in 1 Corinthians 15:5, Paul indicates that was the case. He appeared to Peter and then to the rest of the apostles. And so there was this private meeting. And so when we come to Luke 24, we see them saying, he has appeared to Simon, they say. And then the two guys who were on the Emmaus Road, who had talked with Jesus along the road, sat down with him. And when Jesus broke bread, they thought, this looks familiar. And God unveils to them, opens their eyes, this is Jesus. And they run back to Jerusalem, 7 miles. And they get back and they come upon the apostles, and the apostles say, he is risen, and he's appeared to Simon. And they say, he appeared to us too. And they recount to the apostles how Jesus had appeared to them on the road, and that they were kept from recognizing him. But then they sat with him, and when they broke bread, they thought, Jesus, and then he disappeared there. So they say, we have seen the Lord. Thomas hadn't seen him yet, though. It wasn't until Sunday night that Thomas is gone from them, and Jesus makes his appearance Sunday night of the morning of his resurrection. But we saw in Luke 24:11 that when the women first gave this report of seeing Jesus, remember the women lag behind. So first they go and they see that the tomb is empty and the stone's rolled away. And Mary Magdalene goes right away. She runs back to the disciples and say, the tomb's empty. And so then Peter and John run with Mary Magdalene. They go back to the tomb. Peter and John look in. John's faster. But Peter's more impetuous, and he goes right into the tomb. John's like, are you supposed to do that, to go into someone's tomb? And then Peter doesn't die. And so he says, well, I guess I'll go in too. So John goes in too. But then they go away just kind of bewildered. John believes. He kind of knows what's going on, but it's not real clear in his head. We have that parenthetic comment there. But John believed, but he doesn't quite get it. But then the women lag behind. They stay there at the tomb, and Mary Magdalene's crying. Peter and John have gone back to the house. And then the angels appear as Mary looks into the tomb. And they see these two angels, one at the head and one at the foot of where Jesus had been lying. And the angels say, and they're afraid. And the angels say, don't be afraid. They bow down to these angels. And then they say, but go and tell the brothers to meet Jesus in Galilee. And so they turn and they start going, and then Jesus suddenly appears to them. Mary turns around and she sees Jesus, and she thinks he's the gardener. And she says, please, if you've taken him somewhere, tell me where he is. And he says, Mary. And she recognizes him, calls him teacher or rabbi, Rabboni, there. But they then go, having seen Jesus, and all the women see him, these faithful women. Guys get with it. Okay, this is a rebuke to us. A lot of women in the church that don't have a husband with them. The husband stays at home. Be strong, guys. Lead. You're supposed to. Don't make Deborah lead, like in the book of Judges. She has to be faithful because the guys are twerps. They are. And she tells Barak, who is supposed to go and fight the battle, Barak comes and says, "Oh, please go with us, Deborah." She says, "That's your job, but I'll go with you. But the glory of this battle will go to a woman." Right? So guys, stand up. Don't have it be like Jesus. John the disciples there and all these women. Why weren't there a bunch of men there? Why weren't all the disciples there with their Lord? Right? So the women go back and they report. They've all seen Jesus. They've worshiped him. Jesus says, okay. Now go back and tell my brothers, just like those angels had just told you. Go tell them, I'll see them and meet me in Galilee. They don't go for a little while. But then they give this report and they tell the disciples there in that house in Jerusalem, we've seen Jesus. But it says there that they thought the words, Luke 24:11, the words sounded to them like nonsense. So these disciples hadn't believed. Jesus had talked about he was going to rise from the dead over and over again after 3 days. We'll go to Jerusalem. Here's what we're doing, guys. He said this over and over, like 8 times. We're going to Jerusalem, and there I'll be betrayed by the Jews over to the Romans, and then I'll be crucified. But after 3 days, I'll rise from the dead. He told them this over and over. He told them, we've been studying it in John. I'm going away from you, but I've told you this beforehand so that when it happens, you won't be shaken. But they're still shaken, right? Peter still denies Jesus in the high priest courtyard there. But they hadn't believed. Even when the women, the faithful women who were there at the cross, came to them and said, we've seen Jesus. We just saw him. We worshiped at his feet, and he told us to come and tell you to meet him in Galilee. They still don't believe. But now, in this passage, in John chapter 20, they tell Thomas when he returns, with his to-go bags, they tell him, we've seen the Lord. They're changed. They were saying, we don't believe before. And now they're saying, we believe and we've seen him with our own eyes. We're not just saying, we're pretty confident Simon's telling us the truth. They're not just saying, we're pretty confident these 2 guys on the road to Emmaus saw him also. They're saying, we have seen the Lord. Verse 25. We've seen him. And what does Thomas do? He doesn't believe the testimony of those who were suffering for their faith in Jesus. They had no benefit, really, earthly benefit of following Jesus, of believing this. They were still behind a locked door, right? This would mean great suffering for them. But they say, we have seen the Lord. These 10 were now changed, as Christians today are changed people. You can think about what you were like before your faith in Jesus. Changed people, Christians today are, just like these disciples were changed when they talked to Thomas. And there's a reason for the change. For the disciples, the 10, the reason was they had seen Jesus. Now it was by sight and not by faith. And so they were very confident. And they exclaim, we've seen the Lord. But there's a reason for it today in society too. Christians are changed people because, lo and behold, Jesus is God. He is alive. He is at the right hand of the Father. And he has sent his Spirit. And his Spirit changes people. His Spirit makes people kind, nice, gentle, compassionate, truthful, honest, hardworking. God's Spirit changes people. I'm preaching to the choir here, right? You've been in this church. You know how when you're surrounded by people who have God's Spirit, this is completely different than when you're anywhere else. This is not like what it is when you're on an athletic team or in a classroom or at work, right? This is a group where people pray for you. This is a group where people are glad to see you. This is a group where when you're embarrassed, people are embarrassed with you and don't make fun of you. They're kind to you. They mourn with you. And when you have a relative die, they don't avoid you. They come to you and comfort you. You know, at work, when you have a relative die, people say, oh man, I hope I don't have to, what do I say? I don't know. Right? So Christians are changed, and Christians suffer for their belief. So trust the testimony of Christians about Jesus. Yes, today there are hypocrites in the church, and that's not something that the Bible doesn't see. All the Old Testament is about mostly God's people don't believe, and mostly God's people are wicked. Think about that. The Old Testament, 90% of the people who are God's covenant people, Israel, are doing wicked things through most of Scripture. Okay. The church in the New Testament, wolves and people who abandon the faith, and Judases of various kinds, and lots of warning from Paul and from Jesus about false sheep and their pale, as we sing in one of our songs. So yes, there are hypocrites in the church, and they can be nasty. So we get that. But the Bible talks about that such folks, and is far from making the claim that everyone in the church is truly a Christian, that everybody really believes, that everybody has God's Spirit who's in the church. In fact, the Bible indicates that most are not. Now, this church, it's a wonderful thing. Most are. But there are those who, like most in the church, are wonderful to be around. If you look, if you listen, if you consider the people in the church, just think about this church. We can speak about that. If you think, if you look, if you listen, if you examine their character and the kindness they have for each other, and the kindness they have towards you, the welcome they all have for you, and then compare that to any other kind of group that you're in through the rest of the week, including your extended family. Okay? Say, here's the question to ask. Why would I trust some other group of people and their opinion? People who are nasty. People who backbite. People who, when I get in an embarrassing situation, they distance themselves from me. Why would I trust their opinion, especially when it's about eternal things that matter? Why wouldn't I trust people who are kind, who are gentle, who are truthful, who care for me, who pray for me? You realize that, right? You know something? You're going to hear it from a pastor. Praying stinks, and it's boring. Right? Anyone want to prove that's different? How many people are saying, how many of you are saying, oh man, I can't wait to pray. I'm going to pray 2 hours today, and it's going to be fun. But Christians pray for you. They do something that's unenjoyable. You know what I want to do? I want to watch sports. I want to watch movies and good TV shows. I want to go running. But Christians pray for you. I like to, sometimes I get to take part of ordination services for pastors in our presbytery. And I love when I get the role in the ordination service of the charge to the congregation. One of the people on the commission that comes together to ordain a person gives a charge to the congregation that the pastor's being installed and ordained to. And I tell them, don't mess with this guy. He's praying for you and your own family isn't. I don't say it to him in that way. But if you mess with this guy, if you're nasty to this guy, you're being nasty to the only person who's praying for you. During the week, he's praying for you. When he's preparing his sermon, he's preaching for your soul, for your good, so you won't screw up your life. And you're being nasty to him? Your own family forgets to pray for you. And he's praying for you because he loves you. And that's hard work. And so listen to Christians. And pay attention to their opinion. They're the one, if you're not a believer, guess what? They're praying for you because they care for your eternal soul. They care for your life. The reason they're talking to you about stuff, the reason they're mentioning Jesus to you is because they care for you. and they don't want you to perish. It's not fun for them to bring up Jesus. You might make fun of them. And they bring him up anyway because they say, you're worth it. I'd rather be made fun of than you to perish or for you to screw up your life and to have things be awful for you, even in this life. So trust the testimony of true Christians, especially those who have suffered. They bring Jesus up to you because they want you to benefit. Remember, you believe in a lot of things that you can't see, that you'll never see. And those things that you believe don't have eternal life at stake. Is salt good or is it bad? I don't know. Are fats good or are they bad? I don't know. Remember the early 90s? All the no-fat stuff? You get cookies, what are those cookies called? Snackwells. Yeah, with no fat in it. And then we found out it was full of all this trans fat stuff, which was actually worse than like eating lard or something like that. I don't know. But go ahead. Believe things that you can't see. You have to as part of life. But realize that those things mostly don't have eternal consequences. Many of them don't even have blessing as a consequence of whether you believe those things you can't see or not. But there's one thing that you can't see, and it's Jesus. And what you do with him has eternal consequences. Recognize this. John is writing this gospel in AD 90. No one who is reading this book had seen Jesus. He's writing to them. Okay, think about this. Writer, document, audience. Okay, for those of you who know. So he's writing this book to people who had not seen Jesus. And he's communicating to them, good job. Way to go. You are not like Thomas. Because you've believed and you never saw Jesus. You just simply trusted the testimony of Christians who have been suffering for these past 60 years. Way to go. Good decision. Don't wait until Jesus shows up physically, because then it'll be too late, his second coming. So contrary to what Bob Dylan says in my favorite Bob Dylan song, think twice about discarding Jesus. Think twice. Because he carries with him ultimate blessing. There's something that you can't see among many things that you can't see, but there's something you can't see in which what's at stake is ultimate blessing. Jesus says, but blessed are they who believe, who haven't seen. Ultimate blessing comes from believing in the one you haven't seen and that you will not see until you die or until he comes back. You will not have the luxury of Thomas to have Jesus show up a week later and to say, hey, Thomas, put your finger here and stick your hand in my side. Now, number two. Don't give up hope. Don't give up hope for your friends who are entrenched and aggressive disbelievers of Jesus. Look at verse 25 there. Thomas wasn't there, but he said to them, verse 25, unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where his nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe. That's entrenched disbelief, isn't it? Your 10 best friends for the past 3 years are telling you that the one you followed is really alive. And he's entrenched in unbelief and aggressive in it. He's not just saying, I'm not sure. He's being aggressive about it. No, unless none of them put their finger in Jesus' wrist. None of them put their hand in his side. And he's saying, unless that happens, I won't believe. He's entrenched in it, in verse 25. Jewish Christians who were receiving this book, that's who John was writing to in AD 90, they were Jews who had become Christians, were surrounded by aggressively unbelieving Jewish people. Those who knew the Old Testament scriptures, they knew things about Jesus, and they were saying, we don't believe still. The Jews during this time, right before John writes this gospel, had gone to the Roman government and said, Christianity is not a sect or a division of the Jewish faith. It is a separate religion. And what that did, if you were a sect of the Jewish faith, you were safe in the Roman world. You didn't have to worship the emperor as God. You didn't have to declare the emperor divine because you were part of a licensed religion, which was the Jewish faith. And because you were part of a licensed religion, an ancient religion, the Romans let you worship as you will. And so the Jews didn't have to declare the emperor Domitian divine. They didn't have to worship him and have that be required of them in order to have their union card. They had such thing, their trade guild card, so they could get a job doing their plumbing or electrical work or whatever they were doing back in AD 90. But the Jews went to Rome and they said, Christianity, these churches, they're not part of our religion. And so what that meant for the church was that the church started seeing the Colosseum. They started being individuals that were Christians, started being thrown into the Colosseum and torn apart by wild beasts. They started being imprisoned because they refused to give worship to Caesar. They refused to declare him divine. These were aggressive Jews against those who were Christians. Now, just for today, love your Jewish neighbors and friends. Love them. But back during this day, this was what was going on and the occasion for John's gospel, and then especially the occasion for the book of Revelation. So don't give up hope for your friends who are entrenched and aggressive disbelievers of Jesus. And John is communicating that for all these Jewish Christians who had Jewish relatives and friends who hadn't believed and were being aggressive toward them. He's telling them, don't give up hope that they might believe. Why not? Why should we have hope for those who are aggressive atheists or who have declared decidedly, I don't believe this? Because Jesus is patient and provides. Jesus is patient and provides for all his unbelieving elect exactly what they need in order to believe in him. He's patient. He hasn't given up, so don't you give up. And he will provide for them if he's going to bring them into his kingdom, and we never know who. Right? Saul of Tarsus is killing Christians. And Jesus says, but he's one of mine. And so he provides Saul with exactly what he needs. Blindness. And a voice from heaven saying, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And being given his sight again by Ananias in Damascus. But Jesus provides for all his unbelieving elect exactly what they need in order to believe in him. For Thomas, it was showing up again a week later before he would see them again in Galilee. And so Jesus makes the extra trip, so to speak, and speaks that next Sunday night, presumably, it says a week later, to see Thomas and to let Thomas have what he needs in order to believe. You know what it was for me? It was a children's living Bible. And a little bit behind that, God looked down on me, a very pompous, self-sufficient, thrilled with himself, little elementary school boy who didn't have much trouble in life, who didn't need help. But he knew that if my teacher or some authority or my coach presented a challenge, I was not turning that down. So I hated Sunday school. I went to school at First Presbyterian Church in Pittsford, New York, on Church Street, right off of Main Street. And the pastors didn't believe, go up for a children's sermon, and they were talking about squirrels and rainbows and stuff like that. But my Sunday school teacher in 4th grade said, okay, we got a promotion. If you show up for 75% of Sunday school classes this year, you'll get a free children's living Bible. Challenge issued. Gauntlet put down. So I told my parents, I get a free children's living Bible. I didn't want a Bible. I never wanted a Bible. But the challenge was there. You get a prize if you do that. If you come 75% of the time. Seriously, I didn't care about getting a Bible. Not at all. And I just become enamored with Saturday Night Live. My parents were letting me watch that, and it was like in its second year at that time. I'd just seen Steve Martin literally live do Condo Made of Stona, King Tut. I saw that live. And so that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to stay up for Saturday Night Live and sleep in on Sunday mornings. But Jesus provided for me exactly what I needed. A challenge for a prize I didn't even want. But he knew if there were a challenge issued, I would take it up. I didn't want to disappoint any authority. And so even though there was a Sunday school teacher that I didn't even know, I don't remember her name now, we went 75% of the time. And at the end of that year, I got that free Children's Living Bible. And that ended up being, after a move down to Ohio, sitting in my bedside stand, and that ended up being the source of my coming to faith in Jesus. Jesus will provide exactly what a person needs to bring him to faith. You can think about your own coming to faith and what you needed. Jesus brought that. He brought that along. So Jesus was patient with Thomas. He gave him exactly what he needed. He visits, and he says, in his patience, he shows up and says, "Peace be with you, even you, Thomas." And then he starts talking to Thomas and gives Thomas exactly what he needs. An obnoxious, unbelieving Thomas ends up believing, doesn't he? It doesn't say he's kneeling there. I wish it did. Maybe he was. He says, "My Lord and my God." Isn't that wonderful? The one who said, "I'm not believing. Unless I stick my finger in his wrist and my hand in his side, I'm not believing. I don't care what you 10 say." He believes. So why else do you continue to hope for your friends who are entrenched and aggressive in their disbelief of Jesus? B, because Jesus is also, not only is he patient toward those who are still unbelieving, but he's also powerful. Wow, those are 2 P's. I must be a pastor. 3 P's. He's patient and provides, and he's powerful. Wow, I really am a pastor. I should get ordained. That was happenstance. That was God's sovereignty there. Okay, because Jesus is powerful enough to bring about their faith. Verse 19, the door is locked, and Jesus is there. So the door is locked, and Jesus is there. The locked door doesn't stop Jesus. Jesus dies. That doesn't stop Jesus. Nothing can stop Jesus from bringing salvation to Thomas and from bringing faith to Thomas. Jesus is just too powerful. So think about that with your unbelieving friends, your unbelieving neighbors, your unbelieving relatives. But beyond a locked door, beyond death being not too powerful for Jesus to overcome, Jesus is powerful enough to do something that maybe in one sense is harder to do than either of those 2 things, and that is this. It's to overcome a person's unbelieving heart. And that's what he does with Thomas, isn't it? Thomas is aggressive in his unbelief, maybe even proud about his unbelief. And it goes from pride and resistance and antipathy to saying, "My Lord and my God." Humility before Jesus. That's a huge change right there in like 3 verses that we see here. Big change. Jesus is powerful enough to overcome any unbelieving heart. So don't give up hope for your friends who are entrenched in unbelief or aggressive or who have made a stand that I don't believe. When I was in 6th or 7th grade, after we'd moved back to Ohio, and Jesus had provided exactly what I needed, that Children's Living Bible, he was powerful enough to somehow arrange that was on my bed night stand. It's that stand in that green room up at Grandma's house. My mom's in a different house now. And he was powerful enough for some reason. 6th, 7th, 8th grade, I cared about sports and girls. And for some reason, he had me pick up that Bible. No one asked me to read that Bible. My parents didn't. My church didn't. No one asked me to read it. It was there. And I read it. And I was interested in other things. Wasn't interested in religion. Wasn't wanting to go to have church be my thing. And he had me read it. And he was powerful enough, too, to have me start in Matthew. And you know, that's a dangerous thing, because in Matthew, you get to the Sermon on the Mount. And that did me in. And all of a sudden, powerful Jesus had me reading that. And I knew that my hatred for my opponents on the sports field earned me hell. And I knew that that was tremendously motivational to me on the athletic field. Hatred for my opponents. I would pretend that they were my enemies and that I hated them. And that would fuel me. It was like jet fuel through my body. I scored a lot of goals with that hatred. I scored goals and put it in past the goalie and said something very unsportsmanlike to him after the ball was causing the net to ripple in the background. And I knew I didn't deserve heaven. For the first time, despite what everyone said about me, John's such a good boy, and they did. Read my report cards. My teachers thought I was a delight in class. My parents did. My older brother and sister did. Everybody was saying, John's such this nice kid. And God brought me to grips with, I don't deserve heaven. I have hatred in my heart. I have lust in my heart. I don't love God with all my heart, soul, mind, and strength. And I don't love my neighbor as myself. I don't do to others as I would have them do to me. And so then he provided for me in the 8th grade, my sister, with a simple gospel tract, who shared with me the gospel. And for the first time, understanding why Jesus died on the cross. And I remember where I was sitting, and I remember hearing those words and having in my mind, as I looked toward the Gordon's house out through my bedroom window, but sitting in my living room, that my sins were in Jesus' body on the cross, and that's why he died. And I knew that I needed that, because Jesus was powerful enough to have me read the Bible and to make me realize I wasn't okay, even though everybody said I was. And I embraced the gospel, and I embraced Jesus with relief and joy. So if people had looked at me, they'd say, least likely to receive the gospel. I didn't need help. I was doing well in school. I was doing well in sports. I was doing well in everything I wanted to do well in. My parents were great. My older brother and sister were great. No complaints. I'd moved to a new school and gotten a lot of friends. People liked me. Least likely to receive the gospel. Yet, we're all the most in need of it, aren't we? Because we're all sinners in front of a holy, holy God. So don't give up. Don't give up on those who don't know Christ yet. Don't give up on the Thomases in your life. Even those who are showing no interest and going beyond that like Thomas and saying, I'm not only uninterested, I defy you to prove it to me. Jesus will provide what they need. If he's going to bring them to himself, he'll do it. Let's pray. Oh, you've got a blank. Sorry. He has power to change hearts. That's it. He has power to change hearts. And he can do that with anybody. Now let's pray.